The candlelight flickered violently in the dim temple as the storm raged beyond the worn wooden walls. A frail monk named Daigo, age 78, stood trembling before the scroll that had remained sealed for decades. His hands shook as he unrolled the parchment, breath-catching. "Your mother was never who you thought she was," it read, ink bleeding into the centuries-old fibers. Daigo's soul dropped. This wasn't just news. It was the undoing of everything he believed. The silence around him was dense, broken only by the haunting creak of old floorboards. Outside, a bamboo grove swayed, twisted by wind. The voice of his long-dead master echoed in memory. "Peace without truth is an illusion." Daigo clutched the scroll, heart pounding. Shadows deepened across his face. A single tear traced down his wrinkled cheek. In a world where truth came like thunder, Daigo was just struck by lightning. Nothing would ever be the same. Long before this night, Daigo was a silent keeper of peace, a monk who hadn't spoken in over 30 years. Silence was his sanctuary, but truth is never still. Even now his mind raced. If she wasn't my mother, Daigo thought, who am I? The quiet of his past was now shattered by questions without edges. As a boy, he remembered a woman humming lullabies, but that voice now felt like a stranger's echo. Was he merely a vessel for another's sins? He staggered to a seated posture and placed the scroll beside him, palms pressed to the floor in deep breath. The rain outside matched the rhythm of his heart, unsteady, fierce, alive. Somewhere in the shadows of the room, a truth stirred, something buried deep. The storm wasn't just outside, it had taken root inside him. A memory clawed its way into Daigo's mind. He was 5. Rain lashed against a window while a woman, tall, unsmiling, dressed in black, handed him a red origami crane. "She is gone," she had said. "But remember the bird flies where silence lives." He never questioned who she was. Now, decades later, he realized that moment was his only real clue. The monk opened a small lacquered box he had kept hidden under the altar. Inside, perfectly preserved, was the red crane, edges faded but still sharp. Trembling, he held it before the candle's light. The paper cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. In silence, Daigo began to understand. His life was not built on peace but on forgetfulness. That woman wasn't a messenger. She was the architect of his silence. He stood now, slow but certain, lifting the scroll and the crane together. One truth forgotten. One truth denied. The balance tipped. Stepping barefoot across the wooden floor, he approached the inner sanctum, doors he hadn't opened in decades. As he slid them apart, the scent of time hit him, sandalwood, dust, old ink. Inside was a single portrait, an unknown woman with eyes like his. Not the mother from his memories, but unmistakably tied to him. Her gaze was stern, her presence commanding even from pigment and paper. Below her painting, a single line of calligraphy read, "Truth arrives without asking." He knelt, not in prayer, but in confrontation. His breath steadied. "I will find her," he whispered, though no one remained to hear. And so began his real journey, not outward, but into the marrow of truth. Outside, the storm began to wane, but inside, Daigo's storm surged. He placed the red crane before the portrait and whispered, "You held the silence. I held the pain." It was not an accusation. It was a liberation. The candlelight grew steady as though the temple itself approved. For the first time in 30 years, he felt his voice, not as sound, but as presence. He did not know where the path would lead, but the truth, like water, had found its crack. A monk built for silence was now hollowed for truth. And from that hollow, something sacred would echo, something no storm could ever silence again. Daigo descended the temple steps at dawn, the storm's remnants soaking the moss-laced stones. His sandals squelched with each step, and yet he walked as if every droplet of water knew his purpose. The mountain air was dense with pine, and the afterscent of lightning. He paused at the ancient well by the Torii gate, the same well he had drawn water from every morning for 4 decades. But this morning it reflected something new. His face, yes, but behind it, a question too large for words. His silence had never been emptiness. It had been weight. And now, it began to lift. As he turned away from the temple, he whispered a single phrase. I was never still. I was only hiding. It was not confession. It was reclamation. The mountain did not reply. It only held him in its wind. As he reached the forest path below, Daigo passed an old wooden marker carved with the words, "Where memory ends, illusion begins." He paused. That sign had stood there for decades. How had he never seen it? Or worse, had he chosen not to? The truth of his past wasn't hidden by others. It was blurred by his own devotion to forgetting. Each footstep now pressed against layers of memory disguised as soil. He heard laughter from long ago, his own as a child, spinning in the rain, calling to a woman who never answered. It was not the silence that haunted him, it was the sound of absence. His knees buckled slightly, and he sat beneath a cedar tree. There, he allowed the ache to rise. No chants, no mantras, just breath and loss. And for the first time, they made peace. He dreamt with open eyes. In the shifting wind, he saw her again, the woman in black holding the red crane. But now, she stood farther away, older than memory had painted, her eyes not cruel, but mournful. She was not a punisher. She was a protector of a truth too sharp for a child to hold. In her silence lived 1,000 sorrows. Daigo raised his hand slightly, not in greeting, but in release. The wind stirred the leaves as if acknowledging the gesture. The vision faded, but its weight remained like incense in air, unseen but lingering. He realized then, forgiveness was not a gift he had to give. It was a mirror he had to face. Her silence had become his vow. Now he would break both. Gently, reverently, but completely. He rose again, each movement now deliberate, as though the earth itself deserved reverence. At the next bend of the path stood a small wooden shrine he had forgotten existed. Within it, untouched for years, were offerings of dried plum, prayer slips, and a faded photograph. He leaned in. The photo was blurred by age, but he recognized the woman. Not the one in memory, but the one in the portrait. A child stood beside her. Him. It was proof, left quietly in the world, waiting for him to see. His hands trembled, not with fear but reunion. All these years the world had whispered gently. He had just listened too loudly to the silence. Now, finally, he could hear what was always there. Daigo bowed before the shrine, not as a monk, but as a son. The role he had long abandoned unknowingly, now returned with quiet force. No roads or rituals could contain this moment. His journey was not a seeking of enlightenment, it was a remembering of humanity. He turned and walked on, the crane folded tightly in his sleeve pocket. There was someone he needed to see, an old friend who knew his mother when she was young. Someone he had avoided for decades. The path ahead was steep and root-covered, but his steps were lighter than they had been in years. Not because he was free of burden, but because the burden finally had a name. And once truth is named, it begins to change its shape. Daigo arrived at the edge of the village, a place he hadn't set foot in since his youth. Children played near the temple pond, laughter echoing like distant thunder against the quiet of his mind. An old woman watched from a shaded doorway, her eyes narrowed, then widened. "Is it you?" she called, voice weathered but sharp. Her name was Aya, once a friend of his mother's. Daigo bowed deeply. Aya did not bow back. She stepped forward, her cane striking stone. "You left. When she died, you vanished into your vows. We buried her without you." The words landed like stones. Daigo said, "I thought silence was devotion." Aya shook her head. "No, it was escape." A pause, stretched like a chasm. Then she added softly, "She asked for you. Every day." That broke something in him more than any scroll ever could. They sat together under the plum tree behind her house, Daigo and Aya, old branches curled like memory above them. She poured tea into cracked cups, the aroma grounding. She loved silence, Aya began, but only when it was shared. Daigo listened. She told me once your silence would bury you, that you feared being too loud for a world that never listened to her. Daigo closed his eyes. I didn't know how to mourn her. Aya replied, then don't mourn, remember. She opened a small wooden box and handed him a letter, his mother's last. The paper was stained with time, her handwriting delicate. It read, I hope he finds his voice before the world forgets his name. Daigo held it like fire, both burning and sacred. His silence was no longer sanctuary. It was debt. He spent the night in Aya's guest room. Sleep came like thunder, violent, fragmented. Dreams filled with fire and paper birds. At dawn, he awoke to a strange stillness. Stepping outside, he found the village wrapped in mist. At the center, the bell tower stood, once rung by his mother during festivals. He approached it slowly. The rope was frayed but intact. He gripped it. For the first time in 30 years he pulled. The bell rang out, a deep, resonant sound that cracked across the hills. Birds scattered. Children paused. Aya stepped into the fog and whispered. She would have smiled. That sound was not a ritual. It was a reckoning. His silence was no longer private. It now belonged to the world he had hidden from. Later that day, a young monk from Daigo's old monastery arrived, sent to retrieve him. They say you've broken your vows, the monk said, tone stiff. Daigo studied his face, so young, so certain. I broke a lie, he answered. The monk frowned. You were our pillar. Daigo smiled, not in scorn but sorrow. A pillar must crack to reveal what it holds. The monk looked away, unsure. Daigo stepped closer. Silence is not truth if it hides pain. The monk hesitated, then bowed. Not in obedience, but in acknowledgement. Something shifted. Daigo placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Go back, ring the bell, and listen to what the mountain says after the echo fades. The monk nodded. A seed had been planted. By twilight, Daigo returned to the temple pond. The children had gone, and dragonflies skimmed the surface. He knelt by the water, unwrapped the red crane, and placed it on the pond's edge. The paper absorbed moisture slowly. You were my beginning, he whispered to the crane, but not my end. As the water slowly pulled it away, the paper bird floated like a prayer, surrendering its weight. Daigo did not weep. He watched. He accepted. In that moment, the sky turned amber. The wind slowed. The world, for one sacred breath, seemed to exhale. The crane drifted beyond the reeds, and with it, 30 years of silence dissolved into movement. The journey was not over, but for the first time, it felt truly begun. Daigo made his way toward the village outskirts where an old archive temple stood, a place he had feared more than any battlefield of the soul. Inside, the air was thick with age. Shelves lined with documents forgotten by time stretched into shadow. He lit a single lantern and moved with care. Deep in the back, he found a box labeled Orphan Records, 1940s, that. He paused. Hands trembling, he opened it. The folder bore his mother's name, Tama.Yu. Beneath it, another name, Aiko. A second woman. 2 records. 2 caretakers? No. 1 child. 2 mothers. The silence of the room deepened as realization bloomed. One had birthed him. The other had raised him. And all along he had called only one stranger. His silence had buried 2 women, not one. The air outside hit Daigo like a second awakening. His breath fogged in the late evening chill. Beneath a twisted cypress he sat and reread the records. Oh. His mother, Tama, had died young. Aiko, her sister, had taken him in and raised him in quiet dignity. The woman in black, the one who never said I love you, but held his hand during fevers. He He had mistaken her silence for distance. Now he knew it was sacrifice. He whispered, "I gave you no name, and still you gave me everything." His voice caught, cracking. A wind rustled the trees above, a gentle nod from the unseen. In that quiet, Daigo saw the full shape of love. It was not loud. It was not gentle. It was complete, and it was hidden. He returned to Aya the next morning, the records clutched to his chest. She opened the door before he knocked, as though she had known. He sat across from her once more, this time in stillness, no tea between them. "It was Aiko," he said. "She raised me after Tama died." Aya nodded. "Yes. She loved you as fiercely as any mother could, but she never wanted to replace her sister in your memory." Daigo stared at the floor. "I called her cold." Aya replied, "She called you her light." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was sacred. A kind of silence Daigo had never known. He folded the crane once more, this time not as a farewell, but as an offering. "I will remember both," he said, "and speak their names." He walked to the edge of the village cemetery, where ancient stones leaned with time. A small, unmarked grave rested beside Tama's. He cleared the moss with his sleeves, revealing a name carved faintly, Aiko. Daigo sat between the two graves. "One gave me life," he whispered. "The other gave me the strength to live it." He placed the red crane between the stones. His hands rested on the earth, grounding him in the truth. He didn't weep. He didn't chant. He simply breathed, and with each breath the weight lifted like fog at sunrise. The past had not changed, but his understanding had. And with that, the story of his life, once fragmented, finally stitched itself whole. The village bell rang once at sunset. Not for ritual, not for tradition. It rang because Daigo had asked it to. Children gathered near the pond again, Aya standing with them, eyes wet but smiling. Daigo stood beside the bell, now not as a monk, nor as a son, but simply as a man, whole in his knowing. "We carry our mothers in our breath," he said softly. "We speak for them when we speak our truth." The bell rang a second time. This time not from grief, but gratitude. Aiko, Tama, Tati. Silence. Memory. All part of one unbroken breath. The wind carried the sound across the hills, as if even the mountains paused to listen. Daigo returned to the inner sanctum of the mountain temple, where the scroll first revealed its truth. The storm had long passed, but the memory of that night still trembled in the candle's reflection. He stood before the portrait once more, the stern woman, Tama, and bowed. Then he turned to the altar's opposite wall, where he now hung a second portrait, Aiko. No longer a ghost, no longer forgotten. With trembling fingers, he placed a fresh candle beneath it and lit the flame. "You kept me alive when I chose silence," he whispered. "Now I choose to speak, for both of us." The flame flickered to life, steady and warm. Daigo did not feel divided anymore. He had two mothers, two truths, and one voice, finally his own. That night, Daigo shed his ceremonial robes and dressed in simple traveler's linen. The silence of his monastic years, once heavy as chains, now fluttered away like dust. He stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They had always been there, but he had never looked long enough to see their motion. He whispered, "I've lived as a wall. Now I will live as a window." He wasn't running from the temple. He was walking into the world with the temple within him. Each step forward left behind not rejection, but renewal. The cicadas began their chorus. The wind brushed against him like a benediction. The mountain no longer held him. It had given him back. He made his way through the village in silence, not the heavy kind, but the reverent. People watched him pass and saw something changed. Children no longer looked away. One offered him a single plum blossom. Daigo bowed and tucked it behind his ear. The villagers whispered stories. He speaks now, he prays with eyes open, he remembers names. But Daigo didn't walk for their wonder. He walked to forgive the part of himself that had vanished into stillness. At the river's edge he paused and removed his sandals. The water was cold, but he stepped in. And there, in that sacred crossing, he forgave the boy who believed silence was the only way to survive. By midday, he reached the border shrine, the last threshold before the world beyond. He had stood here once as a boy, refusing to leave after his mother's funeral. Now he stood again, not frozen by fear, but steady with grace. A traveling monk greeted him there, younger and bright-eyed. "Do you leave the temple behind?" he asked. Daigo shook his head. "No," he said. "I carry it now." The monk smiled. "Then teach me how to carry mine." Daigo looked ahead at the path that disappeared into the hills. "First," he said, "we walk." Together they stepped beyond the shrine, two souls moving toward the unknown, feet in sync, silence shared, not as retreat, but as rhythm. As dusk fell, Daigo and the young monk reached a ridge overlooking the sea. The horizon stretched endless, kissed by fading light. Daigo sat on a flat stone and removed the red crane from his pocket, creased, weathered, sacred. He didn't release it this time. He simply held it. "Some truths," he said quietly, "are not meant to be buried or burned. Some must be carried, until they no longer weigh us down." The young monk asked, "Will we know when that happens?" Daigo smiled gently. "Not in words, in breath. In silence that feels like music." The waves below answered like a heartbeat. And there, beneath a sky turning to indigo, the world became still again, but never empty. Daigo and the young monk found a quiet village near the coast, where the ocean whispered against the rocks like an old lullaby. They stayed in a thatched guest house, welcomed with hot miso and rice. That night, Daigo walked the village path alone. The wind here was softer, but his heart beat with strange intensity. He paused before a small stone shrine lit by a single lantern. Inside it was a wooden plaque, "Here rests what cannot be spoken." He bowed instinctively. For all the truths he had uncovered, some parts would remain unspoken, not by fear, but by reverence. He whispered, "There are names I'll never say again. And that, too, is peace." The lantern flickered in reply, not finality, but acknowledgement. The silence tonight felt holy, not heavy. The next morning, Daigo walked along the sea cliffs as gulls traced patterns overhead. The young monk joined him silently. For a while, neither spoke. Then the younger one said, "Your silence, it feels different than others." Daigo replied, "Because it listens." The monk nodded. "And your sorrow?" Daigo thought a moment. "It doesn't ask for pity anymore. Only room." The wind rushed past them, not interrupting, but completing the sentence. They reached a twisted pine tree clinging to the edge. Daigo ran his hand over its bark. "Even bent things grow strong," he said. "And roots find places no one expects." The monk smiled. "I will remember that." Daigo touched his shoulder. "Not in memory, in practice." By midday, they helped an elderly fisherman untangle nets beside the docks. Daigo worked slowly, hands nimble despite their age. "You're not from here," the fisherman said. "No," Daigo replied. "But I carry pieces of many places." The man grinned. "Then you'll fish well. The sea likes old souls." Daigo smiled faintly. Later, as they watched the boat slip out into the water, the monk said, "You belong everywhere now." Daigo looked at his hands, no longer folded in prayer, but working, helping, touching life. "I belong to the silence that gives space for others to speak," he said. "That's enough." It wasn't transcendence. It was participation. It was presence. And it was more sacred than any vow. That evening, Daigo sat on a stone near the village's outer edge, overlooking the horizon. He opened a small scroll he'd begun to write, a collection of lessons, memories, and names. He did not write to teach. He wrote to remember. Some lines were koans, others were apologies. A few were just names. As he dipped the brush, he whispered, "Let no truth vanish unspoken." The ink absorbed into the paper like breath into silence. Aiko wan tun. Tama. Da. Aya. Da. Even the boy he once was. Each name written like a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living who carry them. In the final line he wrote, "Peace is not found, it is remembered." Then he folded the scroll. The wind did not scatter it. It held it like a vow kept. In the final hour before night, Daigo returned to the sea's edge. The village lights blinked behind him, but he stood facing the vast unknown. He unfolded the red crane once more. Its lines creased, its color faded, but its shape whole. He didn't release it. He placed it gently on a flat stone and stepped back. "Not every story needs an ending," he whispered. "Some just need to be honored." The tide reached up, kissed the stone, and pulled back. The crane remained, untouched but changed. Daigo smiled. Then, slowly, he bowed. Not to the sea, not to the gods, but to the path behind him. He had not returned to who he was. He had arrived into who he had always been. The moon had risen high when Daigo sat beneath the same tree where he'd begun his first vows as a monk. Decades ago, he sat in silence, promising to let go of the world. Now, in the same stillness, he welcomed it back. The night was quiet but not empty, filled with the whispers of wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady beat of his own heart. The red crane rested beside him like an old friend. He picked it up, not as a symbol, but as a part of himself. He pressed it to his chest. "I lived in silence to forget pain," he whispered. "But pain remembered me." There was no shame in that, only understanding. He had not failed his path. He had finished it. And now, a new one began, not through withdrawal, but through return. He rose at dawn and walked to the village square, barefoot, quiet, carrying a scroll. Villagers emerged slowly, drawn not by spectacle, but by something deeper. Aya stood at the front, her eyes soft and shining. Daigo unrolled the scroll on the temple gate. On it were only names. Names of mothers. Names of those lost. Names that had never been spoken aloud. He stepped back. "Speak them," he said. "Let no name die in silence." One by one, the villagers approached, reading. Not loudly, not in prayer, but in breath. Aya whispered, "Tama." A child said, "My father." Another, "My sister." In that morning light, memory became a chorus, not weeping, not shouting, but simply present. And Daigo listened. Later that day, Daigo sat with the young monk near the garden, watching bees dance between plum blossoms. "You gave them something today," the monk said. Daigo shook his head. "I gave back what was always theirs." The monk tilted his head. "And what will you do now?" Daigo smiled gently. "What I was never taught, to live softly, to carry names instead of burdens, to leave spaces where silence can rest, but never rot." He stood, walked toward the field, and let the wind push against him. Not in resistance, but invitation. He closed his eyes and let the scent of blooming life surround him. And for the first time, the silence didn't press, it embraced. That evening, Daigo returned once more to the cliff by the sea. He stood where earth fell into horizon, the red crane in his palm again. He did not speak. He only listened to the wind, the tide, and the echo of every name he'd ever carried. The weight was still there, but now it moved with him. He placed the crane in the crook of a seaside rock and left it, not as a symbol to return to, but as a memory to walk forward from. The sky darkened into stars, and in their quiet shimmer he saw no gods, no ancestors, only light, scattered, enduring. He bowed to the sea, the sky, the silence, and turned. Not back, but onward. Daigo did not speak again that night. He didn't need to. His journey had already become a ripple in others, like waves, like waves, like wind, like breath. As he walked down the hillside path, his figure small beneath the vast sky, the narrator, the one who watched, not lived, finally spoke. In a world loud with forgetting, he became a whisper that remembered. And that whisper grew, not as noise, but as presence. The final image, the red crane, still and unshaken, resting in moonlight, not flying, but watching. And then, as if the world itself exhaled, came the final line. A truth wrapped in silence. A sentence too simple to forget. Peace is the name we give to what finally listens back.